Hey, everybody, and welcome to our July 15th edition of our show. My gosh, we're halfway through July already. Summer's just kind of flying by, as it usually does. Today, I want to do a few things. First, I will explain the homework that will be due before Thursday's video, and it has to do with Charlotte's Web, which will be our first example of fantasy. And then we're going to get into The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe next week. And so I want to explain the Charlotte's Web worksheet assignment that you'll find in Canvas. Then I want to go over the midterm exam and give you an idea of what I was looking for in regards to the answers. I'm currently going through those and grading those today, being Monday, and you turned them in by midnight last night. So hopefully by the end of today, I will have all of those graded, and I will send you by email your grade on the midterm, and maybe with a comment or two to explain why you might have missed points here and there, whatever. And obviously, if you have any questions about your midterm grade, please let me know, email me. Obviously, they'll also be posted on Canvas, the grades will be. Then I want to explain the last major assignment that I have not explained yet, that will be due at the very end of the semester, the very last day, which would be January. Boy, I'm giving you a long time for this one. July 9th, Saturday, July 9th. And that's the final paper assignment. So I want to kind of go over potential paper topic ideas with you. That's posted in Canvas. I wanted you to take a peek at that as well for the day. So hopefully you previewed that a little bit. As a 3,000 level class, I always require at least one extended piece of writing, which is the final paper. Obviously, by the end of the semester, all of you will have done the presentation, which is only a couple pages, and you'll also have done the author profile, which is just one page. The final paper is, like I said, a more extended piece of writing that I think in a 3,000 level English class should be required. So I'll talk a little bit about the final paper today. And then finally, I will go over as a preview of fantasy and Charlotte's Web, and also Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I will go over the fantasy notes that are also listed in Canvas. I had you take a peek at those as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So we'll establish the criteria for fantasy today, and then we'll see how those criteria, or that criteria, is met in the two works we're going to read as a class. And then also fantasy, obviously, is a booming genre. Fantasy for kids is a booming genre, especially in the last 10, 20 years, both in books and also movies and TV shows and so on. So there are no shortage, absolutely no shortage of examples of great fantasy for children, and if you want to go a little bit older, young adults, which I also teach, a little plug. I'll be teaching that in the fall. So that's the schedule for today. Let me give you your first number, number 9. Number 9 is your first number in the sequence. Okay. Let's start by going over the homework for Wednesday. Oop, I pushed the wrong button there. Push pause. I didn't mean to. All right. Here is the assignment. Due by Wednesday, midnight. Obviously, again, watch this lecture and take numbers down and take note of the numbers in the sequence. Read Charlotte's Web and read all of it. It's a relatively quick read. Also, there's some readings in the Canvas that I'm going to ask you to read. They don't really have anything to do with Charlotte's Web. They're more of a preview of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But I'm trying to, I'm trying to minimize the amount of reading you do for each class period. So you're going to read Charlotte's Web, but you're also going to read a little bit of information about Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as a preview. And then the 30-point quiz that I'm going to ask you to do and turn into me by midnight Wednesday is the Charlotte's Web worksheet. And let me share that with you. And again, all of this is on Canvas. All right. As you're reading, and well, or wait till after you're done, whatever you want to do. But I would ask you to call to your attention certain aspects of this story that I think make it a wonderful example of what we will call light fantasy. And I'll talk more about the definitions in a minute. And it's a classic. I remember when my third grade teacher read it to us. It's been made into several movies over the years. I'm sure teachers are still teaching it to this day. And one of the reasons it works is not just because it's kind of a wonderful fantasy based in a farm setting. It has endearing characters. Obviously, Charlotte and Wilbur is the main relationship in the story. But what I really like about the story is it really works on a number of different levels, and it's very effective. And again, I hate to keep beating a dead horse here, but particularly for education majors, I think there are a lot of good reasons why this book is still taught to kids and why it remains such a popular classic. And what I think the author does is incorporate a lot of other things in the story, just in addition to wonderful fantasy elements. All right, and here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Notice how, in the course of the story, a child is introduced to, I guess, for lack of a better word, we'll call them big words. Words that may be outside their realm of vocabulary. But, we talked the very first week of class, one of the benefits of literature for children is that it will broaden their vocabulary. And we certainly see that in this book. A lot of big words are used, and usually by Charlotte, not always by Charlotte, and usually because she is the wise mentor character. Notice how a lot of the archetypes from mythology keep coming back again and again. It'll now come into fantasy. We showed how, or we talked about how we see them in folk tales and fairy tales. Now we're also going to see them in fantasy. So it kind of carries over. All right. So Charlotte, being the wise mentor character, is usually the one who uses the big words, and then also in the course of the conversation defines them, not only for Wilbur or whoever happens to be around, but also for the child reader. So as a result of reading Charlotte's Web, there are any number of words that they probably learn the meaning of and the definition of. So look out for that. And notice that I'm going to ask you to include at least 2 examples of each of these. But if you want a little bit of extra credit, if you want a little bit more than the 30 points, you can give me a few more examples than just 2, because there are a lot of them, particularly the challenging words. So every time a big word comes up and is defined, take note of that. And like I said, this is a great book for broadening the vocabulary of the children who are reading the book. Another great thing about the book is that it provides a lot of interesting educational information about farm life, about nature, about the cycle of life, about the life of animals on a farm. And again, one of the benefits of good children's literature is to allow the child to experience other places and other kinds of lifestyles and learn about, things that they might not otherwise be familiar with. I was a city kid. I don't know about you guys. You know, uh, I'd go to an occasional county fair in the summer. And that was the extent of my experience with farm animals. Some of you, usually if I was in a classroom situation, I'd ask, how many of you ever lived on a farm or, had experience with the farm? Some people raise their hands, so they're familiar with this stuff. But notice again, as you're reading, how little bits of factual, real life information comes out about farm life. Now, again, a lot of the story is fantastical. You know, uh, the animals can talk to one another. Charlotte is able to write messages in her web, so a lot of fantasy elements in the story, but it's also very much grounded in reality and very informational. So if I keep talking, I'm going to give away some answers, so I'll shut up. But you'll notice what I'm talking about as you read the book. So note at least two bits of information that we learn about farm life or nature that imparts wisdom to the child reader. Another great thing that White does is he's very good at description, and not just visually what can be seen, but I want you to pay particular attention to whenever he uses imagery that requires other senses besides sight. So there are a number of times when he'll take the time to describe sounds and smells even, and what something tasted like or what something felt like. So give me at least two examples of how sensory imagery, other than sight, is used in the descriptions. And again, White is a master at this. All right, number 4 and 5 kind of go together. I think the book is very symbolic in some ways. Also, we might talk a little bit about this on Thursday, but I think it's kind of like a commentary as well on human life and a lot of the things that happen in this fantastical situation can be compared to things that actually happen in real life. And so we could call the entire story in some cases an analogy uh, or a symbol or symbolic. Uh, so first of all, I think Wilbur, he's a pig, obviously, but I think he takes the place of a child in this situation. All right, he's very childlike, and in some cases, I might say childish. All right, so he is the child representative in the story, even though he's a pig. All right, so as you're reading, what are some qualities, characteristics that Wilbur displays that are very childlike or childish, so to speak? So, we'll talk a little bit more about, I think we might have mentioned this early on, the stories involve animals, but they have human-like qualities, and more importantly, they have childlike qualities that the child reading can relate to. So give me some examples of that in number 4. Number 5, like I said, I'm hinting at this for you. I think there are other things in the story that are symbolic of or representative of something maybe in our world or our lives or our society. This is maybe the more challenging question. This is the kind of thing that maybe kids wouldn't pick up on, but I'm hoping you, as educated adults, will be able to pick on some of the other things. So are there things in the story that are symbolic of or representative of something else? Okay. All right, number 6, we always like to talk about messages, morals, lessons that a story would have. I think there are any number of lessons that a child reading the book can learn. And again, Charlotte is a wealth of wisdom, and she imparts a great bit of knowledge about life. And again, I'll shut up or I'll start giving away answers. But I think there are any number of lessons about life that are dropped into the narrative. So pick up on those and give me a couple of those. Number 7, What do you think would be the best age and grade for this particular book? You know, we always touch on that. We always talk about that, whatever the book is. Oh, by the way, let me give you another number. 19. Second number is 19. All right, so for number 7, uh, what's your best guesstimate on what would be the best age and grade for this book? And maybe we can come to some consensus on that question. And again, maybe you read it as a kid, maybe it was taught to you in school. Do you remember what age and grade? And was that the right time? Did you pick up on everything? Did you understand it? Did you appreciate it then? Or maybe was it over your head? Or maybe you came upon it when you were older and maybe it was a little bit, I don't know, quaint or a little bit too simple. So what would be the best age and grade for the book? And then finally, and I'm going to go over this today when I talk about criteria for fantasy, um, there are any number of devices and techniques that White uses in the book to take what is obviously a very fantastical situation, uh, but ground it in reality. And my little lecture today is going to talk about how authors or excuse me, authors or screenwriters or whoever is creating the story, and they know it's a fantastical premise, but you know, you have to, when you're watching a fantasy or if you're reading a fantasy, you know, there's a phrase or there's a concept called suspension of disbelief. And you know what you're reading couldn't possibly happen. And yet there are enough elements in the story that sort of ground it in reality so that it makes it easier for you to, at least for, you know, the 300 pages you're reading in the book or the 2 hours you're watching in the movie, allow you to sort of suspend disbelief. And that's going to be the criteria in fantasy that I'm going to focus on. How does the writer incorporate these techniques to help make the fantasy believable, even though we know in our reasonable minds in the back of our heads that, you know, this what's being described couldn't possibly happen. And yet I buy into it because there are these techniques that are used that help ground it in reality. So uh, number 8 may not make any sense right now, but hopefully in about a half hour it will, because I'm going to go over these techniques uh, and it's in your fantasy notes. So that's the last question. Give me at least 2 techniques that White uses in the story that help ground the fantasy in reality. Excuse me. All right, so that's the homework. Read Charlotte's Web and then do the Charlotte's Web worksheet. Okay. All right, the next thing I want to do, and let's give you another number. Number 46. Number 46 will be our third number. Let me take a little bit of time to go over the midterm so I can let you know basically what I was looking for. Hopefully you did well on them. One of the benefits of a summer class that's so accelerated is that the midterm comes like 3.5 weeks in, so everything should have been kind of relatively fresh in your memory. You take a midterm in a regular 15-week class session, the midterm usually is like during week 8. So you got to remember stuff that happened like 6, 7, 8 weeks ago. But here it's like, well, we just covered that the other day. So hopefully it wasn't too challenging and too difficult, but I think it was a good test of the basics that we've covered up till now. And again, I'll be grading those and giving you your results within the next day or so, hopefully. All right, so I'm not going to put up a copy of the exam. What I'll do though is I'll give you kind of a shorthand analysis of the answers I was looking for. The first question was, how are any 4 mythological archetypes present in the Hunger Games? And of course, we focused on that. There was even a 30-point quiz on that. So I would assume most of you did pretty well on that because there was so many to choose from. You might have borrowed your answers from, my notes, from the articles by Campbell and Seeger. There's so many elements in the hero's journey, for example, that we see in the Hunger Games. There are a lot of situational archetypes that we see. And there are a lot of character archetypes, like the mentor, the friendly beast, the star-crossed lovers, the devil figure, uh, the damsel in distress. So that should have been hopefully a relatively easy question, but it's important because we kind of focused on that. We wanted to try to show the Hunger Games as a good example of archetypes from mythology. Number two was besides language and violence, because again, everybody would jot that down without even knowing much about the topic. List any other three reasons why books are banned or challenged. And then, could there ever be a justification for banning a book for children to read? Explain a yes or no answer. Of course, the second part of the answer is pretty much opinion, as long as you were able to support your answer. So I wasn't saying, well, yes is the right answer and no is the wrong answer. No, I was just kind of curious to see how you would answer that. Besides language and violence, offensive language, unsuited to the age group, occult themes and Satanism, violence, racism, homosexuality, promoted sex education, religious viewpoint, anti-family, all the things that we kind of went through. There's a good long list in the Canvas that I went over a couple weeks ago. As far as the answer to the second question, that was kind of up to you. I kind of made the case personally that the only reason I can think of for banning a book or challenging the use of it in a school is the age appropriateness question. Even an open-minded sort of person like me will acknowledge that there are probably certain books that kids shouldn't read until they're old enough. Yeah, but maybe some of you would have other objections on other issues besides that one. So I needed you to be familiar with the reasons why books are banned or challenged and then have a take on it. And so hopefully you did well on that. Question 3 dealt with the student presentations, and there were 4 of them altogether. And the two, excuse me for a second. Sorry about that. I couldn't read my own writing here. Let's put this back up. We had 4 presentations from students. The picture book presentations, Kaylin did The Cat in the Hat, and Grace did Red, a crayon story. So you had those 2 to choose from if you wanted to talk about picture books. And then for myth, folktale, and fairy tale, Lauren did In the Beginning Creation Stories, and Tyara did Percy Jackson. So you had those 2 to choose from if you wanted to discuss mythology, folk tales, fairy tales, etc. So I'll be curious to see what your answers are to that. Of course, if you were one of those 4 presentation people, you couldn't write about your own presentation, but I'll be interested, like I said, to see your answers to those questions. I think each of the presentations did a pretty good job of outlining, what qualities of the particular genre did we see or do we see in the work. And so that's what I'm looking for in that answer. Question 4, what are any 3 characteristics, conventions, or motifs of classic fairy tales? And how is each of these motifs evident in one of the fairy tales in the Golden Book collection? Again, besides Cinderella or Beauty and the Beast. So again, I warned you in the previous video that I was going to ask you about, or I was going to ask you to have knowledge about some of the lesser known fairy tales and not the ones that we've known since birth, so you wouldn't even have needed to read the Golden Book fairy tale collection to answer that. So I'll be interested to see which story you chose that had any 3 of these motifs, but here are the characteristics and motifs and conventions, all listed here again. And we went over this just last week. Okay. All right. Then number 5 dealt with the Sparks article, Useful Dangers of Fairy Tales. And here were some of the basic points that she made. We talked about how a lot of fairy tales and folk tales may be dated or maybe too disturbing or maybe, I don't know, for lack of a better word, politically incorrect in today's world. But, in her story, in her article, Sparks actually sort of defends the originals, and even though they may be disturbing. And I kind of summarize what I consider to be her main points. Number one, she wants her daughter to read the originals, not so that it would be traumatic, but she said, we can't shelter these kids forever. And some of these original fairy tales are a good introduction to the fact that, not everything works well and not everything ends happily. And there's evil in the world. And, bad stuff happens. And we should stop pretending, that if we say a thing is so, it must be so. You know, uh, Heroine princesses conquering the world, for example. She wrote in the story, it's one thing to encourage them, but another to whitewash, the real difficulties in life. We don't want that either. We don't want to shelter them forever. Uh, and, fairy tales, the old fairy tales, are perhaps a good introduction to the fact that, not to scare them about the evils that are out there so that they don't want to venture out, but at least let them know that, there's stuff out there that they should be aware of. Um, and she brings up, obviously, the horrors that are out there in the real modern adult world. Things like harassment of various kinds, rape, being targeted, being silenced, etc. And of course, she's writing this for her daughter. Um, she also talks about how a lot of these fairy tales, if you look at it this way, are actually feminist in that they help women rather than lift up women. They warn rather than extol, and that's valuable to a young girl growing up in the 21st century. She even makes the point that a lot of modern writers have taken the traditional fairy tales and uh, made them even darker, rewrote them. Because again, it is important that the child is exposed to reality, not to scare them, not to traumatize them, but to say, hey, these are some things you need to look out for and be wary of. The world can be a wonderful place, and is, but also can be, a dangerous place. And we shouldn't hide that fact from our kids. She writes that emotional distress can be useful. Terrible things do blindside women, she says, and we need to be prepared. We can't be empowered if we're not ready. If we don't know why mothers and daughters disappear, she starts the whole discussion with, why aren't there mothers in fairy tales? What happened to them? And again, I love this line. She says, sometimes the wolf just shows up uninvited and you got to deal with it. And finally, she said, all these truths were evident way back when the fairy tales were written, and they're true today. And the child reader, the young girl who reads the stories, will be able to come to that conclusion herself as well and be ready to do battle. But again, you can't empower them if you don't educate them and you don't prepare them. So I thought it was an interesting twist on, oh, we shouldn't let kids read some of these old fairy tales because, whatever. But she's saying, well, let them read them. There might be some benefits of them being shocked by a story or even scared by a story. So I don't know if you agreed with her take on it or not. I just asked you to summarize her points. I didn't ask you to give your opinions of them. But I thought that was an interesting take, and that's why I wanted to include it in our discussion. Number 6 was basically a listing. I asked you to list any 3 styles of art and any 3 elements of art. And there they all are. So that was pretty straightforward. Number 7, this has been our guidebook, our Bible from day one. It's one of this, I think it's the first thing I went over. What are the values and benefits of literature for children? And I just ask you to, list any 4 of them, and I listed some of them here. And then number 8, you had your choice of 2 articles to discuss. Both of them had to do with the Hunger Games. One of them was 5 lessons in human goodness in the Hunger Games. And here they are with a brief explanation. And it occurs to me that the Hunger Games would be a good example of the kind of thing that Sparks would probably encourage her daughter to read, because it isn't all candy coated and wonderful. I mean, it does deal with real life tragedy and real life dangers. So there they are. And then the other one you had your choice to write about was the Tahir article. He gives several reasons, or they give several reasons why Katniss Everdeen is my hero. And we all have reasons why we think Katniss is our hero, but I wanted you to read the article to see what Tahir had to say. And basically it goes back to the old premise of the hero myth, which is most of the time the main character in a hero myth is a regular person who is special in some way, but is not a god or a goddess. And that includes maybe they have faults and failings. Maybe they're not perfect people. Maybe they're not even particularly likable, but they're thrown into this role, this challenge, and it's up to them to meet the challenge, and they do so. And Katniss is, I think, a great modern day example of that. So, she's adaptable, and she's not perfect, not particularly likable, has some personality issues, which she's aware of. Not even always heroic necessarily. And she's actually haunted by the killing that she does as well. So she's a human being, in other words. She's not perfect. She's not a god, a goddess, an icon. She's just a girl who's trying to survive. And she's put into this position. And again, in the later books, she becomes this symbol, this representative of the resistance, which she does very unwillingly. She's a very reluctant hero, but it's kind of like, well, I guess somebody has to do it, and it looks like it's me, so here we go. And there's great appeal in that, and a lot of us can relate to that. Well, hopefully we can. All right, so you had your choice of those 2 articles. You didn't have to write about both of them. You had to pick one of them. Those were the articles, among the articles I wanted you to review again. So again, we didn't cover these articles in class, but you were responsible for them, and I wanted you to be able to summarize what you considered to be the main qualities and characteristics and, the main points of the articles, basically. So hopefully you did that. And that was the exam. Each question, again, was worth 10 points out of a total of 80. And then I'll figure the number out of 80. Let's say you missed 5 points here or there for whatever reason, 75 out of 80, and then I'll translate it into a number out of 100 so you can get a percentage of how you did on the exam, and we'll go from there. And then also remember, I reminded you of this in the last video, but remember the assignments are weighted. So, the midterm and the final are worth more, say, than, presentations or the 30-point quizzes or whatever. All right, I know I assign them all points, but the midterm is worth 20% of your final grade. The final exam will be worth another 20% of your final grade. Let me give you another number now. Let's go with 55. 55. Again, no Charlie to be seen. Maybe he'll make an appearance before I'm done here. And again, I'm enjoying the pictures that some of you are sending to me of your kitties. Also, if you want to send me pictures of your puppies too. I mean, like I said, I was a dog person through most of my life, but now I have a cat, for better or worse. So anyway, all right. The next thing I wanted to do, we talked about how the midterm is worth 20% of the final grade. The final exam is worth 20%. The last major assignment that's worth, in this case, 30% of your final grade is the final paper. And so I wanted to take a little bit of time now around midterm time to talk about that and explain it. And so let me do that. And again, I had you take a peek at this for today's session. So I'm just going to kind of review this quickly. What I tried to do here basically is give you some ideas on the kinds of topics that you could take on for this paper. The requirement is it should be at least 6 to 8 pages, typed double-spaced, MLA style. If you have any question about the format or whatever, ask me, but it's pretty basic. MLA style, you don't need a title page or whatever. This will be due the very last day that we have class, or the very last day of the semester, which is Saturday, August 10th. A couple of other notes here. You can do anything, you can write about anything that's under the Children's Lit umbrella, and that includes books, movies, TV shows, or whatever. The only restriction I'm going to give you is you cannot choose a work to write about in your paper that you dealt with in either your presentation or your author profile. So I want you to have a little variety here. So if you have any questions about the suitability of the work that you're thinking about writing about, that's something you can start checking with me as early as this week. Just shoot me an email and say, Shank, I'm thinking about doing my final paper on this work and I'm going to do this thesis. What do you think? And I can give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or also perhaps offer some suggestions on how you might develop that topic. I think the only reason I would give a thumbs down is, again, age appropriateness. Sometimes students will choose to write about a book that I would consider more, young adult literature. So that might be the case. So if you have any questions about that, that's something I could answer really quick for you by email. And again, I think any one of these topics would be really good to take on in a 6 to 8 page paper. Number one, analyze the work or a collection of a work as a prime or poor example of the genre. And of course, that's what we've been doing really all semester long, or trying to, and we'll continue to do as we look at other genres. So you might write a 6 to 8 page paper on, why Divergent is a wonderful example of dystopian fantasy for children. All right, that would be a topic that would work in that case. Number two kind of deals with themes and messages and morals. Why is whatever the work is particularly meaningful and suitable for a child of, and then give your age and grade. So this topic kind of asks you to know your ages and stages, and then also know your themes and be able to work them in. Number three is a little bit different, and I know I think we have 2 or 3 education majors. You may want to take this as an option. Put together a lesson plan for a particular work. And again, in a lesson plan, you kind of give a day-by-day outline of what you would have them do, what activities, what kinds of things would you grade, how would you basically share or cover, let's say, Charlotte's Web to a classroom of 3rd graders in a, I don't know, week unit, a week-long unit. Or maybe in some cases, the book, if you're doing Wonder, for example, and by the way, you don't have to do one of the works we do. Again, it's open to anything. but I'm just using the ones we're doing as examples. Wonder, I think might be a unit that would be for an older classroom and might take a little bit longer than the 5 class periods. And again, note it would be set up differently than an essay. You're going to do it day by day using the standard lesson plan format. And again, you education majors know what I mean by that. If you're not an education major and you'd like to try this, and I've had people do that before, and you're a little unclear about how to set it up, that's something I can help you with. Or, you can basically Google, lesson plan template or examples, and you can get a pretty good idea how to set it up. One thing about this, and again, plagiarism is a no-no. And you and I know pretty well that you could, I don't know, you could Google, let's say, Charlotte's Web lesson plans, and probably get a whole bunch of lesson plans that have already been done by somebody and just steal it. I don't want you to do that. If you're going to do this one, come up with your own ideas. Now, I do say occasionally you might come up with an activity or like a crossword puzzle or whatever that you want to incorporate. And the crossword puzzle uses some of the words, having to do with Charlotte's Web or whatever the book is you're doing. And let's say you found that somewhere. You didn't do that yourself, but you wanted to use it. As long as you give it credit, as long as you said, my source for this was, that's okay. But I want primarily all of the activities and the assignments and the ideas to be yours. So be careful about that. And if you do use any sources for any of the activities that you put into the lesson plan, list them in a works cited page, because it's like anything else. If you're citing sources, you need to, or if you're using sources, you need to cite them. Number 4 and 5 kind of go together. We've talked about how a lot of these works are controversial. They've been on banned and challenged book lists. You might take 6 to 8 pages in which you analyze the reasons why people have wanted to ban or challenge a particular work, and then particularly defend that work and give reasons why you would argue that it should not be banned or challenged. Again, make sure it's a work for children and not for young adults, because that gets into a whole other area. So it should be a book considered controversial for kids, well, really birth to 12, but it's probably more likely to be 5 to 12. Occasionally, I've had students write papers in which they say, you know what, I would ban or challenge this book. That's kind of rare, but if they have 6 to 8 pages of reasons why, I'll be interested to read that. Number 5 is similar. Take a stand on a controversial issue involving children's literature and support your arguments fully and persuasively. By the way, you'll notice 2 little stars next to some of these topics, which I'll get to in a minute. I'll explain that. Number 6 deals with themes. Can you think of a particular work for kids that has so many great messages or lessons or themes that that every kid should read this? That could be the focus of the paper, to go through and show how these different lessons, messages, morals are evident in the story. Now, of course, in a lot of very short fairy tales or folk tales, there's just like one message. But if you're talking about a longer picture book, there might be any number of messages and themes that you could talk about as being evident in the story. Number 7, we're going to talk a little bit more about this later on. The concept of tweens. It's that group of children, like from about 10 to 12, and sociologists have started to study this group. They've almost become their own separate group because kids are growing up so much faster now than they used to. So you might write about how a particular work would be a great fit for tweens of today. Number 8 ends up being a pretty popular topic. You can write a paper in which you compare the media version of the work for kids to, did that make sense? Yeah, the media version to the original. Okay, and of course, so many of these works have been adapted into movies or TV series or whatever. And we've all had the experience where we loved the book or we loved the series of books, and then we went to see the movie and it was like, well, in fact, I always suggest if you're going to do a comparison between movie and book, it's probably more fun and more interesting to write about a version that was terrible. Because if it's a good version, you kind of run out of things to say after 2 pages. I think the Hunger Games adaptation, book one, the movie one is a great adaptation. It hits all the right notes. I don't know, I'd run out of things to say. But if you have a lot of issues with, what the movie version did or what the TV series did, and you could give me 6 to 7, 8 pages on that. That tends to be a pretty popular topic. And by the way, I didn't boot this up, but in page 12, 212 and 213 in your packet, there are some tips and some ideas on how you might format a paper comparing a media version of the work to the original. So you might want to check that out if you're interested in doing that topic. Number 9 is, I think, a challenging one to do, but we took a look at picture books, and of course, illustrations are such an important part of picture books. And we did a little analysis of elements and styles of art, and et cetera. But if you're particularly interested in the artwork behind a story and how it's used and how it effectively corresponds with and enhances the story, you might pick a particular illustrator or a particular work and describe how the art is used, including discussion of line, shape, color, all that kind of stuff. Number 9 is more of a comparative thing. Compare the works by different authors that would appear to be quite different on the surface, and what makes them similar. Number 11, I'm a little leery about. It says describe or pick a certain character as an example of a dynamic character. And of course, a dynamic character is one who changes in the course of the story. So they begin as one kind of person, and then at the end, they are much different as a result of the things that they went through the story. It says trace the change that they undergo and the reasons, events that shape that change, and what can a child reader learn from this change. The reason I'm iffy about this topic is because one thing, I'm sure you've heard this from other English teachers in the past when you're writing about literature. What I don't want in any of these papers is just a 6 to 8 page plot summary, about what happens in the story. And then he did this, and then he meets her, and then they do this, and then, if I want an 8-page plot summary, I'll read the book, I'll read the story, I'll watch the movie. Every topic here implies a thesis that needs to be proven or shown. So yes, are you going to have a plot summary in the paper? Of course you are. You'll probably do that in the beginning. You'll kind of introduce the topic, you'll introduce the thesis, you'll give us a plot summary just in case we're not familiar with the story, and then you'll set out to prove whatever the thesis of your paper is. So I don't want it to be, I don't want 8 pages of plot summary. And this topic kind of borderline, because if you're talking about the changes a character undergoes, you find yourself saying, oh, then he did this, and then this changed him in a way, and then he went on and then I don't want a plot summary. So look at that one with care. And then 12 and 13 kind of go together. I singled out symbolism because a lot of works that we've talked about, whether they be picture books or fairy tales or fantasy or folk tales or whatever, you could do, I think, 6 to 8 pages on how a certain work has any number of examples of symbolism that represent things other than what they just represent. So I think symbolism is a great literature term to focus on in a 6 to 8 page paper. But there are other lit terms that you could also talk about too. So look over that list, and you might find that a topic that you'd like to do. Finally, well, I guess that's it. That's the last 12 and 13 kind of go together. What's my rubric? The quality and quantity of points that you make. I am requiring at least 6 full type double-spaced pages. So if you turn in something that's 3 pages, that's not going to cut it. That'll hurt you grade-wise. So make sure you pick something. And by the way, it doesn't have to be one of these topics. I'm just throwing these out as possible topics. If you have another idea in your head that you would rather develop, just run it by me. I'd be glad to check it out for you. How well do you develop and how well do you give specific support for each of your points? How well organized and how clear are the points? And then also any originality or insight that you might want to offer. You know, you can use I in these papers if you are giving a personal opinion or a take on something. And obviously, being an English class, especially a 3000 level English class, I do have to grade on things like mechanics, grammar, punctuation, spelling. And by the way, if you have any questions about that, or I don't know, somewhere down the line, if you have a rough draft that you'd like me to take a peek at, I'd be glad to look that over and offer some suggestions and whatever. And then I was going to explain, like I said, the 2 stars. Some of these, I don't consider this a research paper as such. Oh, and by the way, let me give you another number, 63, 63. All right, I don't consider this a research paper as such. It kind of depends on the topic. And there are a couple of topics, the ones that I have starred, that I think lend themselves to doing a little bit of outside research. So, for example, if you're doing four or five, it seems to me you need to know what the objections people have about these books. So you have to find that somewhere. And then as you are defending your position, maybe you can do a little research and find some people who would support your stand. So 4 and 5 would be topics that would probably require a little bit of outside research. I also think the media adaptation comparison would be probably one that you would use sources. I would check out, I always suggest RottenTomatoes.com. It's a great website for movie reviews. So maybe as support for some of your criticisms of the changes that were made or the additions or how they screwed up the story in the movie, you might call on other reviewers who kind of back you up on this. Or a lot of times it helps to read movie reviews because maybe they'll come up with another reason to hate this movie that you didn't think of, and then you can use their idea as long as you credit them. So again, I think some of these imply the use of outside sources, but not necessarily. I'm not going to have a requirement of so many sources need to be used regardless of what the topic is. It really kind of depends on the topic. And if you have any questions about use of sources for your particular topic, that's something I'd be happy to answer for you. All right. Yeah, so 4, 5, and 8, particularly, I think, are topics that would probably benefit from the use of sources. And I put this in writing. Students caught or suspected of using Cliff Notes for support in their paper will be shot. So I have it in writing just in case. It's a joke. I'm sorry. And again, this is like going to be the very last thing you're going to do for the class. So I thought this image was kind of appropriate. Were you afraid of things under your bed when you were a kid? Did you have your parents check under the bed before they tucked you in at night? Or did you have them make sure that there was nothing in the closet? I'm sorry if I'm bringing up all these traumatic things from your childhood. But anyway, those are potential topics for the final paper. But again, if you have another idea you're kicking around in your head and you'd like to try it out on me, I would be glad to look at any of those. All right. I gave you 63, right? Let me give you 68. 68. Okay, the last thing I want to cover is just sort of a review and preview of fantasy elements. And I ask you to take a peek at this for today. And one thing I'll say right off the bat, I don't have this in the notes, but one of the things you're going to notice is how a lot of the things we've talked about in regards to folk tales and fairy tales and myths carry over into fantasy. We see still a lot of these archetypes that we talked about in mythology and in fairy tales, conventions and motifs. We see them play out also in works of fantasy. So I'll just state that as a given. So we're not going to go over all those qualities and characteristics again, but those also are among the things that make fantasy fantasy. Couple of things. I'll be using the terms high fantasy and light, high fantasy and light fantasy. And I'm giving you an example of each. So we're going to start with light fantasy, which would be Charlotte's Web, and high fantasy, which would be Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And what's the distinction? Well, it's based on the seriousness of different questions and how they're answered. High fantasy is usually more serious than light fantasy. Again, often folk and or myth influenced. Usually contain deeper, darker, more sophisticated themes are addressed with a multi-leveled fantasy. And again, among examples of those would be the Narnia series, the Harry Potter series, the Lord of the Rings series. So all of those would fit under the umbrella of high fantasy. High fantasy does not mean that you have to be high to enjoy reading them. So a lot of, it's a little joke there. Sometimes I just throw out stuff to amuse myself. But anyway, whereas light fantasy, which is usually what kids would start out with, and then they'd probably graduate into the high fantasy. I'm still laughing at my joke. These are less serious. You know, Charlotte's Web is a fun story. It's not to say that the serious things don't happen. And I don't want to give away too many plot spoilers, but it's less serious, more one-dimensional fantasy, talking animals, and that's kind of the extent of the fantasy. And there, like I said, there are no shortage of examples of these. I would include Charlotte's Web. And a book I used to do in this class, I love James and the Giant Peach. So if you've ever read that, that's a great example of light fantasy. What's the goal and purpose of fantasy for kids? Two different takes on this. One of them you read about or will read about in the canvas in the packet. Pierce says fantasy appeals to the children's need for all the wonderful things that we wish real life was like, you know. One of the things that makes fantasy fantasy is that wonderful things happen that sadly don't happen in the real world. And we wish they would. We wish everything was equal, and we wish there was justice for all, and we wish, you know, all of us had hope, but, you know, we find out that that's not always the case. And it provides an escape. You know, fantasy, and I guess this would be true of all ages. Why do you go see a fantasy movie? Because you want to get away from reality for a couple hours. And that's true of all ages, obviously. In fact, maybe adults need fantasy more than kids do. I don't know. But Cooper has a slightly different take, which I think is also valid. She says it's not necessarily an escape, but a way for them to look at the world around them and consider who they are and, you know, make some conclusions based on that, which I think is interesting. One other thing that I wanted to touch on, I'm saying we're doing fantasy / science fiction. So if you're in that presentation group, by the way, and you want to present a work of science fiction, feel free to do that. We're working with 2 fantasy stories in our class. And this question always comes up, so I might as well answer it now. What's the distinction? What's the difference between fantasy and science fiction? It's actually pretty basic. Fantasy deals with things that, and I mentioned this before, we know could never, never, ever be possible in any way, okay? Science fiction deals with things that may not be possible today, but perhaps are scientifically sound. So in other words, we may not have at our disposal the technology or whatever to actually accomplish these things that are described in the science fiction, but they are at least scientifically possible. All right. So I hope, yeah, that's the basic definition and the basic distinction. If you wanted to look into it more, you could. And what's interesting in the course of literature, many books that were once considered science fiction have later become fact as we got the technology and the knowledge to carry them out. So, you know, when Jules Verne in the 1800s wrote about submarines or space travel, you know, that was a concept that was feasible. We just didn't have the means to do it as far as jet propulsion or whatever. But eventually we did. Uh, so we eventually did go into space, and we eventually do have submarines, and we do eventually have atomic power plants, and all these things that were maybe kicked around in the minds of science fiction writers 100, 150 years ago when it wasn't really possible practically, but it was possible theoretically. So I hope that makes it kind of clear. All right, I'm going to focus on, when we talk about criteria for fantasy, I'm going to focus on how does the author make the fantasy believable or realistic enough so that, as I mentioned before, by way of intro, we can suspend disbelief and buy into the fantasy, even though in the back of our reasonable heads we know that this couldn't really happen or exist. How does the author do that? So in every textbook I've ever read that analyzes fantasy, the thing that's really emphasized is how believable is it, even though it's a fantasy? How believable is the setting? How believable is the plot? How believable are the characters and the style and the tone? So again, what makes good fantasy distinct from bad fantasy, it seems to me, is that good fantasy creates a believable world in of itself that we all can buy into, and it's consistent. And even though we know it's not real, it's real within its own framework. All right. And all the rules that are created within the fantasy are consistent. What makes a bad fantasy is when things start happening that are inconsistent with the other things that we thought were true in the fantasy. All right. In fact, that's point number 6 that I'll get to in a minute. It's the last point. How do you make fantasy believable? Well, I found a great article a few years ago that lists the different ways or the techniques that fantasy writers use to help make their stories believable. So this is going to be what I'm referring to. This is what you're going to use in that one question for Charlotte's Web for the homework. And then we'll also see this, definitely see these in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So it's kind of previews that book. All right, first of all, one trick, if you want to call it that, is to ground the story in a realistic setting first, before you move into the fantastical realm. So start in a setting that we recognize or we're comfortable with or exists in the real world. So we literally ground the story in realism first before we move into the fantasy. So we have a primary world and we're eventually transported into the secondary world. So I'm just going to go over these. I'm so tempted to explain how we see these in the 2 books we're going to do, but that's your job, so I'll shut up. Another thing that you might see in a lot of fantasy works is to have at least one of the characters mirror the disbelief of, well, the reader. The character kind of takes our part and says, we're thinking, oh, this is crazy. This couldn't possibly happen, and the character does the same thing. He's a doubting Thomas. That's where that phrase first came from. You have a character who says, I don't believe it, whatever. And then something happens in the story that makes the disbeliever believe. And then once that happens, it makes it a little bit easier for you, the reader or the watcher, to also buy into, oh my God, he believes it. Or she buys, as she was a disbeliever. And now look at her. And she's, okay, so there must be something to it, even though, again, in the back of our minds, we know there's nothing to it. So when this character is finally convinced that these things are real, the reader will too. So again, look out for this in different fantasies, including the 2 books that we're going to do. Another trick is to have a character in the story who's kind of a wise authority figure type, who, we would think would be, a definite disbeliever in fantasy. But no, this wise person actually makes allowance for the possibility that this fantasy could actually be true or could exist. So they help validate the story. So you look at this older, usually an older person, usually an adult in a child's book, and hey, this, you know, this wise mentor figure is not totally opposed to the idea that of this fantasy. Helps validate the story. Number four, another thing that really separates good fantasy from bad is the best fantasies are the ones that are meticulously described. So even though we know this setting is not believable, there is no such place that exists, it's described in such wonderful detail that you picture it, and it's like if you can picture it, then it becomes real. So the use of the senses. Um, and again, we're going to see these things in the two works that I'm going to have you read. But think about if you're a Harry Potter fan, think of how Rowling creates her universe and in such descriptive detail that you're there and you feel it and you see it and you smell it and you taste it. Imagery is important in these stories. Another thing is, once you create or once you have the situation created, then again, it has to be consistent within itself. So the author has to make sure that they make the language of the characters consistent and distinct for each character or group involved. So if I'm creating aliens from another planet, I have to decide, well, what characteristics do aliens from this planet share? And how did they speak? And what do they look like? And I have to keep that sort of consistent. And by keeping it consistent, it makes it real. All right. They have their own way of speaking. They have their own way of moving. They have their own way of appearing. And that consistency makes it real. I don't want to give too much away, but I think in Charlotte's Web, you have different kinds of characters and they all have their own distinct way of speaking. That's all I'll say about that. And then finally, again, this is the real challenge is, and I've kind of hinted at this already, you need to be consistent within the fantasy world that has been created. Inconsistencies in any of these things will be a weakness in the story. And again, I think that's one of the things that separates good fantasy from bad fantasy. The author has thought it all through very carefully and has created this world in such great detail that it becomes real and nothing is out of place, even though we know the world isn't real. I hope this is making sense. The best example I can think of that shows this, and again, I don't know if you're a Harry Potter fan or if you're still a Rowling fan after all the controversy or whatever, which I won't get into, but I read somewhere, and I read it more than once, so I'm going to assume it is true, that when she was preparing to write the final book in the series, she actually hired a fact checker to go back over and read the other books so that when the fact checker read the draft of the final book, she would be able to point out, hey, I'm writing the story, and even I can't remember every little detail that I created, like in book 2, and I want to make sure that I don't have something happen in book 8 that wouldn't follow naturally from what I've created. And I'm not saying that things can't change in the fantasy world or whatever, but they have to be properly motivated. So she, it was even beyond her realm. So she, she hired a fact checker to check the facts of her last draft because she knew, particularly if you're a real fan of a particular series and you anxiously await the next book and you read the next book and you say, no, wait a minute, Harry wouldn't do something like this because in book 3 he said I would never do something like this, and now here in book 8 he's doing something like this and it's not motivating. Or this world that you created in book 3, you go back to the world in book 8 and it's not, you have some differences there that you haven't accounted for. So it's kind of like you didn't do homework on your own story. And true fans, sometimes fans of these works, maybe you're one of them, can be really, 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 really picky, Um, so does the author create a world that is believable within its own rules? And is it consistent? And if there are changes, are those changes properly motivated, or does it show maybe a lack of fact checking? Especially if you're talking about a series of works, which of course is the trend now. You don't have just one book in a, you don't have just one book. It is almost always at least a trilogy, as in the Hunger Games, but then some of these books go on for 7, 8 books, as we saw in Potter. All right, so the question comes up in the Charlotte's Web homework. What are some techniques that White uses to make the fantasy believable? This is the list I'm talking about. Also, as you read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you're also going to see examples of each of these. And then also, eventually, we're going to do a little assignment where I'm going to ask you to come up with some other examples of fantasy works from your own experience or knowledge. And I'm going to be asking similar questions of your examples. So it's something to think about as we start getting into fantasy, starting on Thursday's video. All right, that's all I have for today. Charlie never made an appearance. Have a wonderful Monday. Have a good beginning of your week. And again, I'll be working on your midterm exams. If you have any questions about anything. Oh, one last reminder. I mentioned this assignment briefly. If I have my notes here somewhere. A reminder that your author profile is coming due. That's going to be due by midnight next Wednesday. And I'll be reminding you of that in subsequent videos, but I thought I'd toss that out now. So you have about a week or so to get that together. And if you have any questions about that, I went over that like the first day of class. Let me know. Okay, have a great day, and thanks for sticking with me, and we'll see you next time.